Our next speaker, gallery owner Andrea Rosen, is known for her incredibly well-curated, complex exhibitions at Andrea Rosen Gallery, which she inaugurated with a show by Felix Gonzales-Torres in 1990. Andrea will now speak to us as the president of the Felix Gonzales-Torres Foundation. Through a long personal and working relationship with the artist, she has communicated, understood, and represented Gonzales-Torres' work for almost 30 years. We asked her to reflect on the process and responsibility she took on during his lifetime and after. For us conservators, it is essential to understand the highly contextual nuance of his work and the meaning and use of the material therein. I very much look forward to this in-depth presentation on Felix Gonzales-Torres. Please welcome Andrea Rosen.
Thank you, guys, and thank you, Christian. And I chose not to make a specific presentation because I really wanted to respond to today's presentations, and I'm extra sad about not being here. Being here yesterday because it's so obvious and so inspiring to see the varying aspects and numbers of people, both speakers and people in the audience, who are doing incredible work. And I can also see that this audience is made up of conservators, foundations, and there's so many different issues. And Felix's work really addresses and is a perfect conduit to so many aspects of this conversation. So bear with me because the format of this was, I'm going to bring a bunch of images. I can access them when I need them as opposed to following a particular presentation. So please bear with me on that. But also I could have maybe 5 introductions about this talk. One is, as I had the opportunity of saying, that I play many roles in Felix's work, and the question that was brought up about what are the appropriate formats for artists and their legacies. And so while I am the executor of Felix's estate, I am his gallery, his representative, and now his co-representative. And I am also the president of a foundation. And while Felix died of complications from AIDS in 1996 at the age of 38, and that's an important thing to think about because we're looking at an artist who died very young, and what does that mean, but also the specifics of what he was. And then how there's this part about how do you play out the legacy of an artist? What are your responsibilities? But I'm also really fascinated to respond to what's happened today because every presentation has been really informative. And on one hand, we're hearing from someone as knowledgeable as Chrissy, who's talking about strategies around legacy that have to do with artists that are historical and primarily making paintings or things that can have archives that have little paint chips. And we're talking, hearing Glenn, who is here to talk about this particular project, but to also hear him speak about his responsibilities at MoMA, where, he says 2008 was the first time he was responsible for archiving work like Roman Ondax that was non-object based, but Felix's art was owned by MoMA in the early 90s. So, and Tino Segal's work. And so which are the works that require archiving and conserving and which don't, which is a big, interesting topic as well. And then there's also the aspect of that in terms of time frame also, I remember being on a symposium that was put on by the Guggenheim in 2003. I think it was called the Variable Medium Project. And it was specifically about what is institutional response to understanding each individual artist's interest and desire for the works. And I think that a lot of what I get to think about in Felix's work is about that as well. So here is, I'll put up an image just so you guys aren't totally just hearing me talk. but I'm just going to choose one. So here is Felix, 38 years old, not publicly, but privately knowing, and he was actually quite clandestine about it purposefully, that in some ways, and not in others, because he was an activist, but knowing that he's dying. And what did that mean? But also, what was the nature of his work? And so one of the things I would say, and I'm not sure how many people in the audience are artists or from artists' estates, but is Felix was rigorous about his own agenda. And that was manifest primarily in the work. So it was interesting to hear Chrissy say that she only got 2 messages from Philip Johnson and David Whitney. But she also said that David had told her that he didn't want to be recognized as his life. That wasn't his agenda. So there's a lot of ways to put out messages. And Felix wasn't leaving paper trails of what his agenda was. He, besides the fact that I would say that Julie Alt of Group Material and a scholar and phenomenal person in her own right, and myself were probably in training for I'd say 7 solid years of a way of thinking about the work. And there was also, and Felix's primary resource for how to consider his work in the future was the work itself. So I will also talk about the work, but it was also some very specific decisions. For instance, Felix chose to destroy personally almost all of his personal belongings, his archive. And that's not to say everything. He also made some very personal choices about what to give away and when to give it away and how to give it away, and to create these kinds of separations that create a really rich body around how Felix's work is, what it is about. And I think it's also really interesting to hear Chrissy, when Chrissy was talking about this delineation between the artist's choice to decide what is their legacy. Is their legacy themselves? Is their legacy their work? And Felix was pretty obsessed with the idea that while he was an incredible full person, I think most people who had the good fortune to know him would say he was one of the most, if not the most vivid, amazing, generous, incredible individuals. He was also, as an individual, an activist. He was, so as a person, it's not that he wanted to be forgotten, but he felt that at the core of what a legacy meant is that the only thing that's permanent is change, our ability to change, our ability to move through time. So when we talk about this discussion, a lot of this discussion we're talking about is about permanency, reenacting. Christian says the only thing that matters is the original. What are copies? Those are all questions. They're all questions that need to be addressed. And we are moving into a future where a future is full of questions and multiple mediums. And so I think that Felix was a master at insinuating within the work all the questions that needed to be asked about value, how work and how does value get addressed around original versus non. Whose responsibility is it to continue these ideas? So I'm going to just move away from this for a second and talk about some works, because so this is a piece called Untitled USA Today, and I'm just going to show you some other installations of the same piece. So those are all the same piece, and many of you may know Felix's work, some of you may not, and I could do an entire lecture just about the nature of these candy works. So this is a piece that, go back to the first one. This is its original installation. And it's made up of candy, and that can be taken by the public, for those of you who don't know. It also can its original candies were these. In fact, it had an original weight that was 175 pounds. And yet the nature of Felix's work is that when the work is borrowed, the owner is lending the rights to the borrower, and the borrower is assuming the rights to make certain decisions around the future of that work and the nature of that work. So from what candies they use to what size it is to how it gets installed. And there's an incredible, when we talk about this whole relationship of legacy and our responsibilities, we're thinking a lot about this responsibility of keeping it the same. And what's so fascinating about our work at the foundation is that our primary responsibility is to sustain the openness in Felix's work, which is was and has been a really complicated and interesting thing to do, starting even with, and this may be something I maybe shouldn't say publicly, but we have a board of fellows as opposed to a board of directors. And the fellows are all people who are scholars around Felix's work. I'd say everyone except one person knew Felix in his lifetime, close. And yet the role of everyone in the foundation, or why, it's an advisory board, but it's also about creating a team of people who are equally responsible to this sort of constantly breaking down the fascia of our desire to close things down, to make things permanent, to assume that an original state is its only state. And together we work at breaking down it's almost like we need a team of people to, so someone like Nancy Spector is on that group, for instance, who did a major retrospective, and yet at some point Nancy would have thought, the candies always, because in my exhibitions the candies needed to be this shape, and Felix had, spoke to me about the language around that candy. It's been interesting to see over time where she realizes, as the Guggenheim also owns that work, what the responsibility to allow it to shift and change is. And that's at the core of the work, because the core of Felix's work is about immortality. And while there's a lot of talk in Felix's work about loss and death, and I'm going to move to another type of work, sorry. I'm going to move to stack for a second. Sorry, they're far away. Here we go. So here's a stack piece. And that's both the same piece, as is that. And in the corner of that piece it says holes, hell, Himmler, hate, in each of those corners. And so there's a lot of talk in Felix's work about death and loss, and as you take a piece of paper, it has the ability to allow that piece to totally disintegrate, dissipate, even not exist within the exhibition. And yet at the core of the work is its ability to be rejuvenated, and this kind of perpetual, endless rejuvenation. And yet it also is about the choice of whether it should continue to exist, whether Felix's work is relevant enough to continue to exist, and how people make choices around that. So Felix also said, what is permanent? So, if it turned out that it was never relevant enough, this piece, to ever be manifest again, that he felt that it still existed because it had existed once. So what is existence? What is the work of art? And yet it also meant that because it existed, its new manifestable forms were just additional. It didn't, and so it sort of created a new hierarchy around ideas of original, what he did. But yet, at the core of Felix's work, everything he did was about paring the work down to its essence, so that it could not be, no matter what, destroyed in some way. And it's this idea, I think I think a lot about this idea that I feel like we are, as a a world moving beyond the need for objects to know that we've had meaningful experiences. How do we sustain knowledge and information and experience around things that are more fleeting as well? And here's this form that both has this possibility of sustaining itself, as well as this possibility of existing as an experience. And so much to talk about Felix's work: the role and responsibility of the owner, the role and responsibility of the audience. But in terms of an archive practice of the foundation, and one thing, I'm sorry to keep referring to other people, but it's been really inspiring, where it came up a few times that people talked about time and how things unfolded, how to let things unfold. And that's been a really, really important part of the Felix Gonzales-Torres Foundation, because which was established, Felix died in 1996. The foundation was established in 2002. And for specific reasons as well. But for instance, his foundation does not hold any artwork, and it is, but it's an educational tool. It's to providing information. It talks and is responsible for exhibitions around Felix, but it's also, we're moving into a project now that will be interesting, because truthfully we haven't decided whether we're going to do it within the foundation or outside of the foundation and give it to the foundation. And that's something for the question about what are these different structures and what are they used for, and not allowing certain limitations of one structure to not comply with the artist's intentions. But I realized that over time that it was that, unlike so many fantastic foundations, and I just use the Calder as an example, where you go and there's a record of every single piece of correspondence and every single thing that Calder touched, and every record of the work itself. And it was almost our job to resist creating these hard, fast rules. I mean, there are rules. Felix set up rules, and in that way, I'm very lucky. He set up a lot of agendas, spoken, otherwise. But one of the things that we realized is that there is an incredibly overwhelming desire to concretize, to make things permanent, to close down meaning, to think that only one form is the right form. And so actually, I realized one of the biggest responsibilities was that I needed to wait a certain time. Unlike Felix, Felix, I guess, would have been 60 now, which would have still been quite young. And to allow the work itself to live a lifetime, like a lifespan. And so we are starting to work on a project now that is about what is the archive of Felix's work. And the archive of Felix's work, which of course we've been working on all along in terms of accumulating information, our relationships with institutions, but that archive will be an archive of every single manifestation of every single work. And the archive won't be, this is what you need to do. It will be, you will look in that archive, you will look at the archive of this piece and every time it's been manifest. And you'll have to reconcile for yourself. One will have to reconcile along with the certificate, which uses language in a very interesting and complex way, along with the exhibition history, along with scholarship, along with something that Felix may have said, which frankly he tried to do as very few interviews as possible, because he really didn't want his voice to be the dominant discourse. So the work itself will create its and sustain the responsibility of a future owner, a future institution, a future scholar, to know that they have the right and the responsibility to sustain the work into the future. And that's not to say that all of Felix's works are. It's interesting to look at this, for instance. Sorry, to move around. But there are, for instance, Felix also didn't want anyone to think that there was one way of thinking. So you could think, oh, all of Felix's works can be manifest. All of Felix's work can be taken. But that wasn't true. Within the work itself, in his short and rigorous life and agenda, which he was very focused on, he made sure that within the work there were all kinds of alternative ideas that made you have to question and not become stagnant in your thinking about how to proceed. So there are these three pieces, for instance. This one is owned by the Guggenheim. This one's at the Whitney. This one is a multiple. That you, either the first two, you're not allowed to take pieces of paper. These are both, and they also have to do, interestingly, in relationship to Christian's question, about multiple versus unique. And why do we value things that are unique? Why do we less than things that are multiple? And this, for instance, was based on an edition of 250 prints that he did as for the Public Art Fund when they did this billboard, which is called Untitled Sheraton Square. And it was to fund the billboard. And at some point, Felix, these prints were out in the world, they were being sold, and he decided that he wanted to take back all the ones that hadn't been sold and make it an individual piece, and with the rules that you couldn't take them. And so here, and what's even more fascinating is that someone asked him to make a print, and Felix was rarely concise about why he chose to make anything in a medium or in a, so the person who he was publishing this with, Julie Sullivan, thought that they were going to make a print. And at the end, Felix, and this beautiful print of this silver on this paper, and it's edition work. And at the end, Felix said, oh, but they can only exist all together. And so this reversal of, and they can't be taken. And here's this idea that something that would have been, the value of a print, disseminable. Here's an artist whose works are often accessible to everyone, this sort of trust and belief that everyone is equal in the dialogue. And yet here's a set of prints that were actually not disseminable and became more valuable, and frankly is much harder to maintain and does require conservation and preservation. And so this constant reversal of why do we perceive something as valuable? How do we, constantly have to question that? So, and that brings up something like where Felix, this piece is Untitled Perfect Lovers, is two very normal office clocks, and they were, while they do have. There were instructions like they should be over head height, and that he liked them to be in alternative spaces, although that wasn't dictated. Felix also talked about the idea of why doesn't everyone take two clocks and put them in their home and think that they're an artwork? And certainly there are people who have done that, but it's not a Felix Gonzales-Torres. And talking about why do we consider, how have we created this value system around what an artist says versus what is not considered artwork, and why has this piece risen to be the most valuable piece in Felix's oeuvre, not because of anything other than the market dictated it was. And so here's some other installation views of this piece. So, and then what happens when these clocks aren't available? And that's a good discussion to come to light strings. I like that image. This is an image of a piece called Untitled Summer, as is that, as is that, as is that. That is not. But what's interesting is the other one is a multiple. And not only are there discussions about the fact that there are 18 works in Felix's oeuvre that are all light strings, all of a similar length, 42 bulbs, and what makes each of those unique, but also what happens with this material. And this is a particularly interesting example because unlike a stack or a candy where there was a kind of phrase in Felix's work about ease of manifestation. And it's always blows my mind how he pre-thought so many things about not only globalization, but movement or ecology of not shipping artworks around the world in crates. And it also makes me think a lot when Glenn was speaking about MoMA, how Felix's work already in the 90s completely shifted the MoMA's practice of lending work, its accessibility, where you had a situation where it would potentially take a year to get, you'd have to apply to borrow work a year in advance from MoMA. But in the case of Felix's work, they realized as long as it was a worthy exhibition, there was no reason not to lend candy works and stacks and even light strings, which was a little bit more complicated. But and how it completely shifted, like literally immediately, the entire agenda of the registrar department and its ability to be mobile, and even its ability to shift works between departments. And so, but it's interesting because we think about the shift in light bulbs. So, and I mean, there's so many, his work is so complex. And again, I wanted to say that each body of work purposefully had different conditions to push against so that we never became complacent about assuming that there was one way, that it always required our continued responsibility to think about the nature of the work. But light bulbs and even the materiality of this work. So this is a piece. I happen to own a light string that hangs in my house, and until 2 years ago, I never even thought about not hanging the original light string, because for Felix, this material was common material. It was replaceable. If it was shown in another country, he would even just chop off the plug for an American plug and tack on a European plug. There was no sort of fetishizing. Although I do want to also say that there are bodies of work, like in this picture of photographic works, or where he purposefully chose works that were potentially not only solid, but again, a reversal where photographic works became the hardest works. Photographic works that might have been considered the least valuable in his practice became the most needing of care. They are, in fact, the most difficult to borrow for exhibitions, strangely, or not strangely, but certainly a reversal from other artists. So, but then we come into this conversation about light bulbs and what happens when we've moved from one form of light bulb to another. And Felix set up these ideas about standards. So if it was a standard, there's a lot of language and the evolution of language actually as well in Felix's work, but where we still perceive this form of light bulb to be what we perceive a light bulb. So there's, it's also the things that we talk about in the Fellows Forum, but would it be appropriate to change all these light bulbs and put those, curly light bulbs in it? And the primary position would be about sustaining the work and not having it unencumbered, but but it was also about a standard. So it's complicated. One of the most rewarding things about the foundation is we don't know everything. It's really the reason why there is this body. The body of the foundation is to continue to have a body to rigorously explore the questions that come up. And for instance, a really great example of that, going back to the stacks, is at some point the medium of those work, of a stack work, was lithography. Was not lithography, sorry. While the medium of those early stacks, when he made them in his life, were lithographic process, he referred to the medium as offset print on paper. And it was a way of, within language, describing what was the most common practice. Because at the time, would lithography make it sound like it was a print? Offset print on paper made it sound like it was a commercial process. He thought a lot about those words. But as Felix was pre-digital, when we came to the point where we were looking at medium, and we realized that offset print on paper implied that someone would need to go to the process of going back to old printing methods, find not digital printers, that it would encumber the process. We used a series of the way that Felix spoke or information, and decided to actually change the medium of those works to print on paper. And we used an example, for instance, of the billboards that were a body of work that came later in Felix's practice, where he himself had changed the medium from printed billboard to just plain billboard. And the evolution of language in Felix's work is a whole other incredibly interesting topic. Here, just to show you some other manifestations of that piece. So that seems like a really radical idea, to change a medium, but those are the kinds of, that is really what the foundation body does a lot, is really it's not changing things all the time, but grappling with what is our real responsibility at keeping the work open and sustaining it in the future. And I actually had included a bunch of slides of a show that Tino Segal curated of Felix's work as well. And this map is an indication of, it's part of an exhibition called SubSpecific Objects Without Specific Forms, that the overarching curator was Elena Filipovich, but the exhibition existed in 3 institutions, and for every institution she did an installation of Felix's work, and then she invited an artist to take down the whole exhibition and reinstall the show. And the artists were Carol Beauvais, Jan Vo, and Tino Segal. And all of them were incredible, and the way they had no responsibility to keep the same checklist, but Carol did something where she kept one floor of the exhibition completely the same, but she became the caretaker of the work, either physically or even, as she said, sort of energetically, where even if she just went around and touched the works, they became different, versus Tino's, where he literally did 6 completely different installations. So this is a map of how the works just constantly were shifting and moving. And because of that, he could make some pretty radical choices about installation. Stacks in doorways that people might have to walk over, pieces on the floor. And he developed these sort of devices to move them within the installation as well. And here's just a playing out of a stagnant work. This piece is called Untitled Orpheus Twice, but throughout the exhibition, how different it looked because of what was around it. So this goes into sort of more stagnant works, and so these are a body of work that may be referred to as date pieces now, but used to refer to them more as photostats, which is interesting because photostats don't exist anymore. So, and they're meant to be reflective. So he purposefully chose a material that was non-permanent, even though this was a framed work. And he purposely chose non-archival materials even for stagnant works, like puzzle works, where he just shipped them off to commercial photo labs, and they came back in non-archival bags, and it was about these sort of questions about permanency. But he also felt that they were, while some of his works he felt were reproducible, others, photographic works, he would never allow to be reproduced. And once they were damaged or they were destroyed. So there was always reversal in his work as a way of making sure we were never considering only one approach. But there was a similar situation where these were always intended to be replaced when they faded. The photostatic medium no longer existed. What kinds of decisions were we going to make around another medium? And our decisions ended up being around both a combination of aesthetics and what was considered now the most common commercial medium, which is actually inkjet. And again, we changed them. And in this case, every one that is of its medium is referred to as its medium. So I'm pointing out a lot of exceptions, but and I'm just going to show you some photographic works, and then I'm going to stop. A piece called Untitled Natural History. And it's interesting to think about this piece in relationship to this conversation because it's a set of photographs that were taken from outside the Museum of Natural History, and they are the benches in front of the statue of Theodore Roosevelt, and above the benches, they're either above benches or in between the benches. Engraved in the walls are the attributes of Theodore Roosevelt, and it's a perfect example about this idea of the only thing being immortal is something that can change. And Felix is not the only artist that's made work about this monument. Both David Hammonds and also Mark Dion have made works commenting on that what's in front of these photographs is a sculpture, is a bronze of Theodore Roosevelt on horseback, and what at the time was a very progressive sculpture where he is standing with what we now refer to as a Native American and an African American. At the time were Negroes and Indians. Those Negroes and Indians are barefoot, they're holding his feet, and yet that statue remains there to this day, and yet it is how it transfers to the time. It's certainly interesting in relationship to our discussions in the news, but Felix was referring to the absence of that sculpture. And this is a piece that predates, obviously, this discussion, but also about what is permanent and how we're obsessed with monumentalizing. So these are other photographic works that also deal with the same issues. This is a grave of Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein. If you notice, all of Felix's titles are untitled in quotation marks, and all the parenthetical titles are outside the quotation marks, leaving them open. About fleetingness. And these works, again, are permanent and worked on and non-restorable. So I have so many ways to go, but maybe it's better if people have questions about what aspects they'd like me to talk about. I guess the only other thing I meant to say was I think it's really, for the artists, it's artists' responsibilities to set agendas. And again, back to what I was starting to say about the symposium in the Guggenheim in 2003, that whole symposium was about making sure that museums became responsible for taking on information in the form that artists wanted it to be taken on.
Thank you for this. This was amazing. I'm really interested in what Martha Buskirk quipped was the new works on paper, basically these artworks that don't necessarily have that permanent manifestation, and that does rely on contracts and certificates. And I think you and Felix collaborated quite extensively on that. Would you share a bit on that with us, please?
Sure. The certificates are definitely one of our ongoing responsibilities at the foundation, because along with the works transforming, so do the certificates over time, which for many people was a radical idea. And it's interesting to think about how, for me, Felix is so inspiring because it's really shown me that that we are evolving in our ideas and even in our ability to describe things. So, for instance, when the very first stack was made, it was clearly Felix's intention that they could exist in more than one place at a time, that nothing about their ability to transform space and time limited their ability to be a unique object, and yet it was completely unfathomable in the marketplace at that time. And no one could really understand that idea. So in the original certificate, it literally says it cannot exist in more than one place at a time, as a way of defining the work. And quickly after that, a year and a half later, in a certificate in Felix's life, it says the works can exist in more than one, that the uniqueness of the work is defined by ownership, and the works are not, its uniqueness is not impugned by the fact that they can exist in more than one place at a time. It's also what keeps the practice open for institutions to lend the work to more than one place at a time. And the fascinating thing about the certificates is, on one hand, it's nerve-wracking and really complex to continue to work on certificates, but the responsibility and the role of the certificate is very different than the role of the work. And it was a set of language that Felix initiated, a certain set of words that he used that were also about openness, ideas of describing original words like manifestation, which was not a copy. There was a significant amount of language that Felix evolved himself, and certainly, again, this sort of training process of what that meant. So at no point were the certificates intended to be dictatorial or even explainable. I mean, there are times when there really also this responsibility of the owner to decipher what that information means, what part they want to take, what part they understand now. And what at the key of Felix's work is that it says that the new owner's name is supposed to be on, it's his intention is that new owner's name is on each certificate for manifestable works. And that alone forces this process of reinitiating the certificates in their most appropriate current form. And for a while there was this whole discussion about, well, how can we, it's again one of these things where it's so amazing to know how life has changed, our ability to conceive ideas have changed, that at first it seemed that people couldn't perceive the idea that they would have changed. So they were only the new certificate was presented, whereas now the foundation's policy is that all previous certificates are superseded and attached, so there's this lineage of every single change. And now if one changes hands and that didn't happen, we go back and add it. And it's not because, it's this constant process in the foundation where we think, were we wrong? But it's really, you come to this point where you realize you could not have known this until this moment. And so for us, that's the role of the foundation in terms of legacy. It's this responsibility of continuing to be rigorous, thinkers around the progression of the work. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Andrea, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I think we had this discussion once, and that's also like one of the moments when we thought we should have this symposium. That was when we spoke about the two silver rings, and you said Felix always wants them to be shiny and bright. And so we try to come up with a solution, and there's a way to clean them, and the foundation gives recommendation how to clean them. But ultimately, the silver will wear off, and then we said, can we use a coating, because silver tarnishes over time. And so we thought this is a real conflict, and the conflict does not come from the concept, but from the material, how the material acts. And that's why we are here together to think about how, I think conservation is a wonderful tool to explore the ideas of the artists, and that's where so many questions come up.
it is, and it's true, just like the having to work on the certificates, these issues as they come up are opportunities to think about these ideas, and luckily Felix set some parameters. And the interesting thing is, and again, it's really important that, and it was very purposeful, he was a very purposeful person, that the photographic works, for instance, that predominantly dominate a particular, especially the closer to the end of his life, were made by hand, made by him, dodged and burned, really very specific. And so in that case, within their nature was that they could not be conserved. They were very specific. But for much of his work, and it was also, he wanted us to reflect on both, to be able to reflect on both simultaneously. But for much of his work, he wasn't really choosing the materials. So, and purposefully, I mean, it wasn't out of lack of interest. It was, how do I give up control? How do I give up my hand? I am not going to be here. How does my, knowledge of my impermanency allow me to give up a certain kind of control, whether that's, sending puzzles off to commercial photo labs, or, doing this piece and saying, well, what do you think is going to a fabricator? What do you think is going to accomplish what I want? So that's a sort of middle range. So while it's as you know from our experience with that, we certainly didn't take it lightly. It took a long time. These decisions about photostats took probably at the chagrin of whoever wanted to replace them, took 3 years. It wasn't like we make these decisions lightly, but they do unfold through the process of Felix's intentions. And so it didn't seem like a conflict to put a shot in. And yet we didn't go back and tell every owner, oh, now that we've decided this, you need to do this. And so that's interesting as well, where we did, for instance, update all of the owners, it's an edition of 12, on the cleaning methodology. We didn't tell everyone they needed to recoat them. So it's also this open process, not because we thought it was threatening to the work, or the value of the work, but because each is open to a discussion of whether they would prefer to let it deteriorate, or in that case. So, or we didn't go back and tell every person who owned a photostat to now change them into inkjet, because it's not about this obsession with it, but there is, it's about finding solutions, and that solution might change. So, oh, sorry.
Hi, really interested in the archival project that you've announced, and really looking forward to that and applaud that. Of course, I immediately have a lot of questions about who the archive is going to be, how open the archive will be, access questions. When you're talking about documenting the manifestations of the work, the nature of that documentation, whether it would just be photographic, whether it would be other kinds of material around that. From my own perspective, I've also been really intrigued by the fact that in the past, at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong going forward, the certificates have remained private.
Yes.
So that one has to try to guess from the manifestations of the work how open the work might be, but one can't actually know how open the work is described. One only has to look at this evidence of each different version.
Well, it's that is the basis of my responsibility, having lived beyond Felix, to try and manifest those different aspects. And it really comes down to this sort of belief in the trust of the audience. So, and that everyone is equal in relationship to the work. But it also brings up, I could talk just about this and those delineations, but it's also interesting to think that there's a time issue, like we spoke about, which is maybe one day the certificates won't, but for now, it's really amazing, because the understanding of Felix's work, Felix has been dead for 22 years, which is a shocking, and it's still just at the gestation, where if Glenn can talk about that we're just at the point where we're conserving the first installation. It's like people's ideas and abilities are expanding radically, but it can't be at the expense in the foundation. It's almost of people knowing that they have the right to interpret the work. But that said, the work also has very specific, it does have specific parameters, like the role of the owner doesn't have, the audience doesn't have the same rights as the owner, or responsibilities. There was a situation where there was a light string that was lent for an exhibition, and there's this very specific process about you lend the rights to the borrower to decide how the light string is installed, how you configure it. That institution took it upon themselves to put up a sign that said, oh, anyone can change the installation, and people were making hearts, and but that's not a part of the work. And yet the audience has an incredible responsibility within the work. So, but then in terms of the archive, yes, the goal is that archive will be public. And it's a really interesting moment in the foundation, because, and in relationship to Felix's work, in relationship to my own practice, I just gave the gallery, I was honored to be able to give the gallery's archive to the Smithsonian. And what does it mean in terms of making things public. But the goal is that there had to be a span of time in order to accumulate enough information, in order for it not to be dictatorial, in order for people to be able to perceive that. And it's also, what is my responsibility, since I'm not going to be alive for everyone? What am I leaving behind that allows for a mimicry of what Felix taught me? So he wasn't able, it was purposeful that he wasn't able to create that body of information, but what is my responsibility to mimic the way that he taught me to think about openness of ideas? And I came to know that it was allowing the work to live, and allowing the work to speak for itself. So, but it's also, it is possible that practices will shift as there is a greater understanding but it's also interesting because, again, the certificates are not some like key that is a secret. It has this, they're like scores almost, and they're quite they're quite purposefully they're purposefully open in their own way, but it's about what does language do versus an experience? What does scholarship do versus the work? And that's, sort of building. So it's not the only project we're doing. We're also, we have something called the Felix Gonzales-Torres Archive, Inc., that is doing an oral history project, because maybe not all of the oral history belongs in the foundation. And when you have an oral history, when you have a foundation, you are bound to eventually make every aspect of that work public. So someone like Ronnie Horn, who sits on the fellows, would say, well, Felix would never have wanted all of that public. So we don't know what part should be public or not. And so, we use different entities, which was a question someone brought up before. We're not trying to be clandestine. We're trying to do the best job that we can for Felix and use this idea of time. It was a huge responsibility to take on, and for many, many years, and I'm sure still, there's a guilt of like, how much can I do? How quickly can I do it? But it became clear that it had to be about this responsibility that unfolded over time, not because there was a lack of trust of the public, only that it needed to evolve over time. So it's, the core is this trust, and I don't know if that answers your question.
I have two questions. One has to do with the candy spill. Maybe we take USA as an example. It's red, white, and blue candy. I don't know what the candy inside is. Does it matter what the candy inside is? And what if the source for the owner has dried up? There's no more candy from that company.
Well, that
Do you help?
happens. That happens all the time. So,
Okay.
Again, it's a progression, because Felix he never picked the flavor. It just so happened that it was a flavor. Although sometimes he liked that it was a flavor. He's like, "Oh, great! Those gold candies are coffee. Awesome! I'm not making light of it. There certainly were decisions, but it was those were aesthetic decisions, and it's also evolved. A candy piece is a really great example. So yeah, when it says ease of manifestation, and frankly, it doesn't say you have to pick a red, white, and blue candy. Even it implies, there's this assumption, it says original installation, it describes what it was, but the truth is that if someone wanted to be radical and make it purple, there's nothing in the work that says that can't happen, or that because it existed purple once, that it doesn't mean that the piece didn't exist in all its other forms the way it did, or that it doesn't, so there's this like, what does it mean, or how often and Felix, I think, wondered why people weren't more radical about their inclination to be engaged in the work, and that's really cyclical too. So I'm not just interested in Tino taking the liberty of really, altering the work from in each of those installations. For instance, the candy piece was installed in a completely different way within the same exhibition. If you spent a day and a half there, you would have seen all 6 installations of a single candy. But it's this core nature of what about that would disrupt the work. But there's also hierarchy. Original is a powerful word. An artist's intent. So, and within his life, he installed works differently, and he never, he never used necessarily, and he also gave up. It's interesting how in the oral history, it's coming up again and again and again that he never dictated to people what to do. You know, someone may have asked a question and he may have given an answer, but it was, and yet there are certainly absolutely rules because he pared things down to its essence. And
If we have time, would you finish your thoughts about what you were thinking about your own light string?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I know that I went off track. Only that, you know, at some point I thought, was I wrong to, you know, if I was ever to consider selling that piece, should it be considered that while Felix may not have considered the material to be of particular value in relationship to the piece, perhaps the market would. And so, but that said, a light string piece was sold to the Byler that had been owned, and the original owner, who's a sort of deep collector of Felix's work, had, when they lent that piece, lent the original consistently. It had been replaced with all kinds of material that no one really gave much thought to. And then when it ended up in the Byler, there was we probably took 3 months to see the trajectory of that, and did that matter in the market, and were they going to correct any of the life of that piece? Or, you know, we do now allow for the concession because of that for people to use exhibition copies in relationship to the light strings. But there can only be one. Light strings can only exist in one place. So if an owner lends the work and doesn't want to lend their original, then they have to take theirs down, and the exhibition copy. But it's not referred to as an exhibition copy as well. So it's a convenience, but it's also and the exhibition copies are not owned by the owners; they're owned by the foundation. So there can't be two in the world, but it's. But so those are the kinds of concessions that have definitely happened, but are unique to each body of work again. So thank you for asking that. I meant to finish that thought.
All right. I think this is time for the lunch break. Thank you so much, Andrea.